Hey everyone, thank you for joining me today for my talk. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Today is going to be an updated talk from the one I gave about 2 years ago now, where I went over my email design system in Parcel, and now we have it updated, which is why we are iterating on a complex email design system. So we have a couple of slides to go through, and then I'm actually going to hop into the code to show you exactly what I do. Now, it's a lot to go through, so we won't get to everything, but what I hope to do is just to give you kind of a high-level understanding of my considerations and the things I changed to get my email design system up and running in the visual editor. So before we begin, who the heck am I? You might already know who I am, but if this is the first time you're seeing me, hi, we can be friends. I'm Megan. I am the senior email developer at Cinch. I code all the emails for Mailgun, Mailjet, and Email on Acid. I am the host of Email on Acid's Notes from the Dev. We are trying to get that back up and running. If you want to see it more, write on LinkedIn, write everywhere. Tell my bosses you want more of it. I also occasionally write my newsletter. It depends. Another newsletter about email marketing. And my famous email design system stretches across several brands and ESPs and is now compatible with Parcel's visual editor, which makes me so excited. In my personal life, I am a mom to an 8.5-year-old. Last time I gave this intro, she was 6, so I don't know where time's going. And I love to powerlift and hiking, and I coach soccer, and now I practice karate. And I hang out in rural New England, which is also super fun. And it's good to see me, isn't it? Get used to the wicked references. That is my whole personality now. All right. So last time we were together, there were some things in the email design system, some things that weren't so flexible. So we could only work in HTML. So anything that was dynamic, we had to run them off form inputs like radios, checkboxes, and those sorts of things. There were tons of limitations, things that we couldn't do because we had no access to advanced JavaScript. So this meant that we also were swapping a lot of classes in and out to accomplish things that we could more easily accomplish, again, with JavaScript. And our Outlook code, the MSO code for our ghost tables, so I code with divs and ghost tables, was very, very inflexible, led to a lot of bloated code. So what's updated this time? But now our components are way more flexible with JavaScript. And I know JavaScript can seem really scary to email developers, but I promise it's not. It's totally not scary. It's awesome. I am now in love with JavaScript, at least in this capacity. Our MSO code is extremely flexible, so flexible that I have one component to rule them all. So anything I need to do with Outlook is basically done in this one component, like VML aside. We don't touch any of that today. And like I said before, we now have visual editor support and a lot of code refactored, which is pretty awesome. Fun fact, when I recorded a video for my manager to show her that I could get a basic email up and running in the visual editor really fast, I did it in under 3 minutes. And it was pretty incredible. A lot of work went into it before being able to do it in under the 3 minutes, but we can do it. And the one thing I want you to remember, TLDR, JavaScript makes an email design system even more powerful. Can't wait to get in this code. Let's nerd out. All right. This is the old way of doing things. I mentioned that HTML with all the inputs. Look at all this. This is a lot. This is a lot of stuff. And the context and all this information. This is how we swap things in and out with these radio inputs. It was a whole lot of stuff. But if we go over to the new way, let's look at how we can get things working for this visual editor. All right. So now we have a bunch of JavaScript. Don't freak out. It'll be okay. So I always like to speak in complete sentences a lot of times when I'm trying to learn new code things. So for example, with HTML, I will be like, okay, I need a header 1 that is H1, or I need a paragraph that is P. I need a break that is BR/. So let's do the same thing here with the JavaScript. And once I started doing that, I started understanding this a lot more because I was very confused at first. So we're going to skip some of this other stuff for now. And Parcel has really great documentation to dive into this a lot more. But let's talk about these props, because for me, this was kind of hard to understand at first. So where we had these field sets before, those are now your props. So let's talk about what all this means. So export, this is taking all this information and making it available in the visual editor. Const is short for constant variable. Those are things that aren't that dynamic. We will always have these options, as we see here under lang or category, ESP. Props is our variable name. And in this case, props is short for properties, which is why we have this component dot define props. So we are in a component. That's why it says component, I think, most likely. And then define props, because we are defining the properties. So here you can see for my base, I've set up a bunch of these things. I have to be able to switch my language. I have to change the category of the email. Sometimes I have to code for different ESPs, and I have to switch the brand, and I have some tracking. So here you can see the component.props.enum. That enum allows you to switch options. I believe it stands for enumeration, which is just iterating through different options. And you can see how I've done that for a couple of different categories here. What I then do besides that is, instead of everywhere being props.brand, props.lang, props.tracking, I can actually set them as their own variables, which makes it a little bit easier. We can say lang equals, tracking equals, and that sort of thing. The other part of this with JavaScript now is that we can start dynamically setting things like colors, which is amazing. I sound very enthusiastic right now. I hope you feel my enthusiasm here. So here we can start looking towards our global colors, but then start breaking it down by brand. We have, I have Mailjet and Mailgun done in here. I don't have email and Acid. But for example, we have different primary and secondary and text colors for different things, text links. So you can see the differences here. And then remember that context you probably saw as I was going through this? All this JSON. If you can write JSON, just keys and values, you can do the stuff you need to do in JavaScript. We start taking all that information and putting it in here under its own object. So we have const mailjet. You can see all this stuff. And with the colors, so this is just calling in different colors dynamically. We can put in things like our logos and website links, everything we need. We do the same thing for Mailgun. So from here, now, instead of using const, because if you remember, const is for constant, the variable doesn't change. But what if we need to switch between the variables? That's where let comes in. So we let brand equal mailjet. We're letting the brand equal mailjet. But if the brand or props.brand is equal to mailgun, you're going to start switching between these different things like logos, links, blog, CTA. And that will start switching things like your colors, text, website links. It'll pull everything from up here and switch appropriately, which is pretty awesome. I have the same thing for a bunch of ESPs. And from here, we can also set contexts. So in the old version, if you were using contexts, you would in other components do context dot whatever. Here, we just set it. And then in other components, we can name the variable and get it. And you'll see that in a moment. So from here, we're going to go over some really basic things like section, row. We'll talk a bunch about the columns and a bunch about Outlook. So with the section, this is what I use to kind of contain everything, kind of like a row, but rows can go in the section, and I use it a lot to control background color type things. So you can see we follow the same principles here as we did in the base. We have our props and we have our section background. We can do some spacing, the type of section, because I also do call outs and banners, and sometimes those break out of the container, which is what a section is good for. And then if we need to align things to left or right or center, I also set spacing values here because my spacing between sections or rows are done by bottom padding. So it's good to have those set up to match this spacing. So that's why we have const spacing values, and it means to run it through the spacing object to look for these keys here to match them to these values. And here you can see when I was talking about calling components before, we have this component.context.get. So you can see here, I'm calling in a width value. I'm calling in a width, calling in colors. I'm also setting different spacing values so I can bring them to different components. Another thing that I really love about using JavaScript, and I can show you even more about how this becomes really cool and important in a different component, probably with the columns, is instead of writing everything in classes and then using your inliner to inline them, you can set your styles and have them automatically inline. If we go down here, we can start bringing in different classes based on different variables. And then our style, we can just call those objects in. It'll automatically bring the styles in. So there's no more managing it in the CSS, but also potentially managing it inline. We do it all in the JavaScript, and then the JavaScript generates it for us when all the code's put together and we export, which is pretty awesome. We can also take advantage of these fragments. The fragment, which was also in the legacy components, those don't render in the HTML, which means you don't have to end up with like random extra divs just writing some if-else statements. So we can also add in different bits of code depending on the context. So for example, if this section is actually a call out, we can add in this table, which helps with like the structure of the call out. So we can start doing things like that. Okay, let's move over to our row. So here we do some more spacing. I control the spacing in my emails using like none, extra, extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. They mostly move in increments of 8 pixels. I work on an 8-pixel grid. I try to work mostly with units, which makes things a little bit more flexible and responsive. I also have this Boolean for reverse columns. So I can make sure like with text and images, the image is always stacking on top. Because that's a challenge we can run into sometimes with these layouts. So you can see, again, variable row style, row padding, row collapse. These are all based on different things that I can do with the row. Where this really shines, though, is how it works with my columns. So we're going to look at that real quick. So I'm actually going to have us look at the old way I did columns because it's kind of like janky, really. So if we look here, we have all these radios with all these widths. So the one thing to know about my email design system is that when it comes to design, I have it super locked down. Like we're only putting content in there. We should never be messing with any of the styles or anything like that. So I have like things like widths on lockdown. You might want yours to be a little bit more flexible in that sort of way. But for me, I don't want that. But you can see here, like when I talked about using a lot of classes before, the columns are perfect because like I have width full, width half, width 1/3, width 1/4, width 3/4. Like I have all these classes, all these things I have to maintain, right? So it gets really messy with the context. And then with my Outlook stuff, we have to do all these fragments with component matches, and we have like our tables and then our table cell changes based on the width or based on the width and the align. Like this is messy. You have to admit this is super, super messy. And then we have all this other stuff here, which at the time is incredible. It was incredible we got this working at all. But now we can do it so much better. So much better. Okay. So let's go over to the new code. We'll talk about this in a moment. Presets are amazing. All right. So in our columns, in our props, we set up our width. And we can set up some other things. We're not going to worry about the align stuff right now. We will go over, we have our column type, because you can have columns, and I also have a card design to use in the columns, which requires a little bit different. So the way I set this up to be able to handle columns is that we have this with context that runs through our with object. And we have the JavaScript do some math for us. So in my old email design system, I had everything on percentages, which in one way is really flexible. But the drawback is that that percentage is always based on the width of your content. So if I didn't have, say, an image with the content and I wanted the text to be half the width of our wrapper, it wasn't happening unless I put enough text in there, which was always really frustrating to me. And I didn't really know how to solve for that until recently. So this is where math comes in, right? So we just base it off 624. This is because the width of my full email is 688 pixels, and our actual content area with the padding ends up being 624. So I based it off that 624 value. So we just start doing some math. And in JavaScript, you have math.ceil and math.floor. That says you're going to do this equation. You're going to do this multiplication in this case. In ceil, you're going to round it up. Floor, you're going to round it down. It depends on how it ends up mathing out. Here, it made sense for me to round up because the value ended up, over like the 0.5 threshold. You round up if it's over 0.5, round down if it's under 5. So that's what happened here, since you don't get a whole number with the 1/3 or 2/3 width. And we get some really lovely fractions happening. Everything starts laying out really nicely this way. And then once again, we can start taking our width here, comes in dynamically. It gets inlined dynamically. We set some width stuff, some column stuff. Then we start bringing in components from the row to reverse thing, a row context. We'll go over that in a moment. And as we go down here, you can see we do some more if-else stuff. So we have our column. But then if it's a card, because with these columns, the display is like a table cell, an inline block can get kind of messy. So I use table cell. We needed an inner div to handle a background color for our card design. So if the column type equals card, we put this div in and bring in the card style with the slot, which slot is, where other information goes when you're in the visual editor. Otherwise, it's just the slot, which is pretty sweet. So now how do we handle multiple columns? And this was quite a challenge to figure out. And a huge thanks to Mark Robbins, who put me on the right path here. Set up this row context. So a lot of times when we're working with context here, you tend to write like your variable and then the variable again. But with context, you can bring values through, which is awesome. So up here, I have a column variable in an array to handle up to the number 4 for 4 columns. I've only set up to 3 so far in the email design system, though. We rarely use 4, but I'm eventually going to have that be an option, just in case. So we come down here. We set our row context. So our column, that's the column number 1, 2, 3, or 4, and current column 0. Because what's going to happen is that these columns are going to be counted starting at 0, because that's how programming works. So if I come to the module column, we can look up here and we bring in our row context. And then we have this last column variable where things are going to start counting, right? So we're going to find the last column and kind of count from there. And that will tell us how many columns we have. Now in here, it's not going to matter much because everything's with a div. But where it starts mattering is in our favorite place ever, Outlook. Don't we just love Outlook? Let's take a moment for Outlook, which I loathe. And I have loathing. Unadulterated loathing. Oh my gosh, for its coding. I loathe it all. I don't really loathe it all. It's actually kind of cool what we do. So here, same thing as everywhere else. We have our props. We start bringing things in. One thing I did with this module to get it working everywhere is within each module, so section, row, or column, this component can support one of the three. And depending which one it is, this is the width it's going to use. I also had to bring in spacing separately because depending like where this table shows up, it doesn't always show up in the right spot to bring it in. And then we have under our component styles, again, the JavaScript, it just starts switching out depending on your component. So you can see how this gets like really powerful quickly. So if we head down and start thinking about our columns, we have code specifically for columns because without doing this, the code doesn't know what it's looking at for counting the columns. So we nest all this under this component equals column. Else you just get a regular table. And now we got to look at if it's one column, we open it up. If it's a card, we're going to add in an inner table with a slot. Otherwise, the next part is just a slot. If our row context in the current column is equal to 1 and the width context is under 608, which means it's a smaller column, or that's what this little double straight line thing is, the current column is equal to 2 and the width context is equal to 208, we're getting a little bit dicey here using absolutes like this, but this is how it works currently. We close the cell, open the cell, which is our ghost cells. Otherwise, we're closing the table. So now you can see how we have this really dynamic component where we're not maintaining a bunch of repetitive code. It's a little bit repetitive. I don't think there was a way to really avoid it, but it's much, much less repetitive than before. So now that that's all set up, you can start making things called presets, which all show up like regular components. So this is where we start getting that speed of, say, making an email in less than 3 minutes. So say you want a single column. On these presets, you can set this content and you tell what HTML needs to go into your document. So this is for one column. Then you can see for 2 columns, we have 2 columns there. And I have them automatically set for the most part for double columns. Oh, it's this one. It's the header text CTA. Here, this is for 2 columns. So you can see how I set that width to half. And I start setting things up for an image left, an image right, a 3-column layout, 4-column layout I don't have working yet, but I have that set up already. So like this is where the magic happens, right? Let's set this up really quick. So ignore the standard components. Those are the ones that Mark expertly coded. And if you're just getting started with the visual editor, it's a great place to start. So remember those presets? Those all show up here. And I actually have everything organized by different things like a structure or content, typography. So now we can start building stuff. So we want columns with header text CTA. All right. So now we can start building this stuff. So we have a column with header text CTA. We drop it into our section. Boom. There we go. And I'm just going to go down this and just start adding. And there we go. This is an email. We're good. We just got to put in all of our content. A couple of quick other things I can show you. We're almost out of time. I don't know if we're going to have time for questions, but hopefully we will. For things like headers, what I've done is I have this type element. I thought it was kind of crazy to have a separate component for each header. I tried that at first and I got annoyed very quickly. So you can just I don't even have to highlight that text. I can start just going here and switching it out for each type. But say I'm at a header 1 and it's a really long header and I want that text a little smaller. I can just say throw in an H2 class. That'll make the text a little bit smaller. And if I want to center it, I can. So we start doing things like that to make our email development and creation way faster. What happens if we're working on something in one brand but need to switch it to another? Done. And there we go. All right, so I know that's a lot of information that I've thrown at you. And I think we might have time for a question or two. So let's talk. If we don't have a chance to talk here, you can find me on LinkedIn, find me in Email Geeks or Instagram, and I will be more than happy to talk to you about email design systems. I so hope you found this helpful.